There is a research project buried inside ArcRadar's lore that almost nobody talks about. And once you understand what Project Echostride 40 actually was, you will never look at the Stella Montis facility the same way again. Hey, so before we get into it, I just want to take a second to explain why I made this video and how I put it together. I have been deep in ArcRadar's lore for a while now, and Project Echostride kept coming up in fragments. A document here, a piece of audio there, a reference in equipment descriptions that most people scroll past. I decided to pull all of that together into one place, because I think this project is genuinely one of the more fascinating and underexplored corners of this universe. One specific choice I made when assembling this: I deliberately put the science before the politics. A lot of lore videos go straight for the drama and the collapse. I wanted to show you what Echostride was actually trying to do before I showed you what went wrong. I think that changes how you feel about it. So that is the structure here. We are building the full picture from the ground up. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1: The World That Built Project. Echostride. To understand why Project Echostride 40 existed, you have to understand the world that made it necessary. ArcRadar's is set in a future where humanity has pushed far beyond the boundaries of Earth, establishing settlements and operational outposts in environments that the human body was simply never designed for. Low-gravity environments, in particular, presented a category of problems that nobody had fully anticipated before people actually started living in them. The physics of how sound travels, how the inner ear processes spatial information, and how the brain interprets sensory input all behave differently when gravity is reduced. These were not minor inconveniences, they were operational liabilities. In the earliest days of off-world expansion, the medical and engineering communities were largely focused on the obvious physical challenges: bone density loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular changes, radiation exposure. These were the well-documented dangers that filled the research papers and got the funding. The sensory side of things, the way humans heard and perceived and navigated space in low gravity, was treated almost as a secondary concern. Researchers noted the issues, filed the reports, and moved on to what seemed more urgent. That approach worked until it very much did not. The facilities being constructed in orbital and near-orbital environments during this period were designed primarily for efficiency. They were compact, they were functional, and they were loud in ways that nobody had properly accounted for. Machinery vibrated differently. Acoustic reflections in pressurized enclosed structures created feedback patterns that disoriented workers. Personnel operating in these environments began reporting a specific cluster of symptoms that did not map neatly onto any existing medical category. They described difficulty locating the source of sounds. They described a persistent sense of spatial uncertainty, a feeling that they could not quite trust where things were in relation to their bodies, and they described fatigue that seemed tied directly to the effort of processing their auditory environment. These reports accumulated slowly at first. Individual incidents, individual complaints, filed and acknowledged and largely set aside. The assumption was that it was an adjustment problem, that the human body would adapt as it had always adapted. But the adaptation did not come, or at least it did not come quickly enough to matter for the people living and working in those environments. Every day, the complaints kept coming, and eventually they started being accompanied by something more measurable than subjective discomfort. Accident rates in low-gravity facilities showed a statistically significant correlation with the duration of a worker's deployment. The longer someone had been up there, the more likely they were to be involved in some kind of incident. And a disproportionate number of those incidents shared a common thread: a failure to correctly respond to an auditory warning signal. This was the moment when the sensory problem stopped being a secondary concern and became a primary one. If workers could not reliably hear and correctly interpret warning signals, then the entire safety architecture of these facilities was compromised. Every alarm, every automated warning, every spoken instruction from a colleague on the other side of a pressurized corridor, all of it depended on the assumption that the people receiving those signals could process them accurately. That assumption was failing, and the people responsible for keeping these facilities running needed an answer. The answer, or at least the beginning of one, came from a research division that had been quietly working on human sensory systems for years. Milai Analyze was not a household name in the wider world of off-world expansion. They were a relatively small organization operating at the intersection of medical research and applied engineering. They did not build the big infrastructure. They did not design the habitats or the transit systems or the extraction equipment. What they did was study people. Specifically, they studied how people experienced the environments they were placed in, and how those environments could be modified, or how the people themselves could be modified to create a better fit between the two. Milai Analyze had been tracking the sensory complaint data from low-gravity facilities with considerable interest. Their researchers saw in those reports something that others had missed, or at least had not articulated clearly. The problem was not simply that sound behaved differently in low gravity. The problem was that the human auditory system had been calibrated by millions of years of evolution for a specific gravitational environment, and that calibration was now operating in conditions it had never been designed for. This was not a hardware problem, it was a firmware problem, and Milai Analyze believed they could rewrite the firmware. The organization had been running smaller-scale studies on auditory perception in modified environments for some time before the larger crisis brought their work to wider attention. They had documented specific patterns in how the vestibular system, the part of the inner ear responsible for balance and spatial orientation, interacted with auditory processing in reduced gravity. They had theoretical frameworks for how those interactions could be supported or enhanced through external technology, and they had a growing body of prototype work that suggested their theoretical frameworks were not entirely wishful thinking. When the accident data from the facilities started making headlines, Milai Analyze was positioned to offer something that nobody else could: a specific, science-based program for addressing the auditory component of low-gravity human performance. The pitch was not a dramatic one. It was methodical. Milai Analyze presented their data, laid out their theoretical models, and proposed a structured research initiative. They suggested that with proper funding and access to operational facilities, they could develop a range of technologies and protocols that would meaningfully improve human auditory performance in low-gravity environments. They were careful about their language. They did not promise miracles. They spoke in terms of measurable improvements, testable hypotheses, and staged development timelines. It was the kind of proposal that appeals to administrators because it speaks their language. And it worked. Project Echostride was the result of that proposal being accepted and funded. The name itself is interesting. Echo suggests the acoustic research at the heart of the work. Stride suggests forward motion, progress, the kind of language you put in a program title when you want people to feel like they're moving towards something. The combination has a purposeful quality to it. This was not named like a bureaucratic filing. Someone thought about what this project was supposed to represent and chose a name that reflected that. Whether that someone was at Milai Analyze or in the funding body that approved the work, the law does not make entirely clear, but the name stuck and the project began. The early phases of Project Echostride were, by most accounts, relatively conventional research work. Teams were assembled, facilities were designated for study, protocols were written, the specific environments being studied, low-gravity habitats at various altitudes and configurations, presented logistical challenges that had to be managed before the actual research could begin. Equipment had to be calibrated for environments where even the tools used to measure sound behaved differently than they did on Earth. Researchers had to spend time in those environments themselves, adapting to conditions that would affect their own judgment if they were not careful about it. These are the mundane realities of doing science in unusual places, and the early records from Project Echostride reflect them faithfully. What emerged from those early phases was a clearer picture of the specific problem than anyone had previously articulated. The vestibular disruption caused by low gravity did not simply degrade auditory processing in a general way. It affected specific aspects of it. Directional hearing, the ability to locate the source of a sound in three-dimensional space, was particularly compromised. The brain uses tiny differences in the timing and volume of sound arriving at each ear to build a spatial map of the acoustic environment. In low gravity, the fluid dynamics of the inner ear change and those tiny differences become harder to pass. The spatial map degrades, and when the spatial map degrades, the ability to respond quickly and accurately to sounds, especially warning sounds from unpredictable directions, degrades with it. This finding had implications beyond the immediate safety problem that had motivated the research. If directional hearing was specifically compromised, then the solution was not simply a matter of making sounds louder. You could turn up every alarm in a facility to maximum volume and still have workers who could not locate the source of those alarms. The fix had to be more sophisticated than that. It had to address the underlying processing mechanism, not just the input signal. This insight is what pushed Project Echostride into territory that most straightforward safety research programs never reached. Because fixing the processing mechanism meant engaging with the human body at a level that went significantly beyond anything Millay-Analyse had originally proposed. The decision to pursue that deeper engagement was not made lightly, according to what the law suggests. There were researchers within the project who were uncomfortable with the direction it was heading. The original mandate was to study and understand the problem. It had grown into something more ambitious, actually enhancing how the human auditory system functioned. These are different things, and the gap between them is filled with questions that science alone cannot answer. Questions about what it means to modify human perception. Questions about who has the right to do that, under what conditions, and with what safeguards. Those questions were raised. The law points toward the fact that they were not fully resolved before the work continued. The version of the project that would eventually become the most significant, the one that researchers and historians within the Ark Raiders universe would come back to when trying to understand what Millay-Analyse had actually built, was Project Echostride 40. The number is not arbitrary. It suggests a sequence of iterations, a long development process that worked through many versions before arriving at this one. 39 previous attempts, or 39 previous phases, or 39 incremental refinements. The law does not spell out exactly what each iteration involved, but the implication is clear. Project Echostride 40 was not a beginning. It was a destination that had taken a great deal of work to reach. Understanding what made the 40th iteration different from its predecessors requires understanding what the project had learned and what it had discarded along the way. The early attempts at sensory enhancement were, from what the law suggests, largely external in nature. The researchers started with the most conservative approach available: modify the environment, not the person. If the problem was that sound behaved unusually in low-gravity habitats, then the first instinct was to redesign those habitats acoustically. New materials, new layout principles, acoustic dampening and shaping that would counteract the specific distortions created by reduced gravity and the pressurized enclosures in which people lived and worked. This approach had real merit, and it produced real results. Facilities that incorporated Millet Analyse's early environmental design guidelines did show measurable improvements in auditory performance for the people working in them. Accident rates went down. Worker satisfaction with the acoustic environment improved. The researchers had demonstrated that the problem was real and that it could be addressed. But they had also discovered the limit of the environmental approach very quickly. You could design a new facility around optimal acoustic principles. You could not redesign every facility that already existed, and the people who needed help most urgently were already deployed in facilities that were already built. The environmental approach was a solution for the future. It was not a solution for now. The next set of attempts focused on personal equipment. If you could not change the room, maybe you could change what the person was wearing. The concept of auditory enhancement through wearable technology was not new, of course. Hearing aids had existed for centuries. The specific challenge here was designing something that would function correctly in a low-gravity environment while addressing the particular kind of directional processing degradation that had been identified. Early prototypes were, by the accounts the law provides, bulky and inconsistent. They could amplify sound. They could filter out certain kinds of noise. But getting them to genuinely improve directional processing required a much deeper understanding of how the inner ear and brain interacted in real time, under real low-gravity conditions, in a way that the early prototypes simply did not have access to. Iteration followed iteration. Each version of the technology taught the researchers something new, and each new piece of knowledge raised new questions. The project files suggest a team that was genuinely engaged with the problem, that cared about getting it right, and that was willing to discard approaches that were not working even when considerable effort had gone into developing them. This is, in the law's framing, what good science looks like, but good science has a way of leading you places that you did not plan to go. And Project Echostride was heading somewhere that its original architects had not imagined when they started. The first significant breakthrough came in the domain of what the project files call resonance mapping. This was the discovery that the specific pattern of vestibular disruption caused by low gravity was not random. It was structured. It followed predictable patterns that varied based on the specific gravitational environment, the individual's physiology, and the duration of their exposure. If you could map those patterns accurately enough, you could in theory develop an external device that would generate compensating signals, essentially feeding the auditory system information that counteracted the distortions created by the low-gravity environment. The resonance map was the key. The question was how to use it. The answer to that question took several more iterations to develop, and the path toward it involved some of the most technically demanding work the project undertook. Building a device that could generate real-time compensating signals required sensors sensitive enough to detect the tiny variations in the acoustic environment that mattered for directional processing. It required processing power compact enough to fit in a wearable device. And it required a delivery mechanism that could get the compensating signals to the auditory system in a way that the brain would actually integrate with its existing processing, rather than experiencing as a separate competing input. This last requirement turned out to be by far the hardest. The human brain, it turned out, was not a passive receiver. It did not simply accept external acoustic inputs and incorporate them without friction. When the early compensation devices delivered their signals through conventional means, through small speakers or bone conduction transducers, the brain consistently experienced the compensating signals as a separate layer of sound rather than an integrated part of the acoustic environment. The result was an experience that subjects described as deeply uncomfortable. Two overlapping acoustic realities, neither of which felt fully real. Rather than improving directional processing, the early compensation devices made it worse in a different way. They replaced one form of confusion with another. This failure pointed the project toward the core insight that would eventually define Project Echostride 40. The problem was not just about signals, it was about integration. The brain needed to experience the enhanced sensory input as seamless, as native, as part of its own processing, rather than as something imposed from outside. Achieving that level of integration required a much more intimate connection between the technology and the body than anything the previous iterations had managed. And that realization is where the project crossed a threshold that changed everything about what it was and what it was trying to do. Millet Analysis researchers began exploring what they called direct resonance induction. The concept, as the law presents it, was to develop a device that did not simply add signals to the acoustic environment, but instead directly influenced the pattern of neural activity associated with auditory spatial processing. Rather than giving the brain more sound to interpret, the goal was to give the brain a better processing framework to apply to the sound it was already receiving. This was a fundamentally different approach. It was no longer purely acoustic engineering. It was beginning to touch neuroscience. And that transition marked the moment when Project Echostride became something that the original safety research mandate had not prepared anyone to handle. The ethical discussions that the law points toward happening at this stage were not trivial. The project had started with a clear and defensible purpose: help workers in hazardous environments do their jobs more safely. That purpose had not changed, but the means of achieving it had evolved into something that required people to consent to a device that directly influenced neural processing, in an environment where the power dynamics between researchers and research subjects were far from straightforward. Workers in low-gravity facilities were not volunteers recruited from a willing pool of experimental subjects. They were people with jobs to do, and the implicit pressure to participate in a safety enhancement program, when the alternative was to continue experiencing the documented impairments that had already caused accidents, was not subtle. The law does not paint this as a story of pure exploitation. It suggests something more complicated. Researchers who genuinely believed in what they were doing and genuinely believed the technology was safe and beneficial, but also researchers who were perhaps too close to their work to see its implications clearly, and administrators, both at Millet Analysis and in the facilities where the research was conducted, who were focused on outcomes, on the accident data improving, on the productivity numbers going up, in ways that made the ethical subtleties feel less urgent than they were. This is a recognizable pattern in the history of research that pushes into uncomfortable territory. The people doing it rarely think of themselves as doing anything wrong, and sometimes they are not. But sometimes they are, and at this stage it is not entirely clear which category Project Echostride falls into. What is clear from the law is that the work continued. The direct resonance induction approach moved forward through a series of increasingly refined prototypes. Each one got closer to the target. Each one produced more integrated, more seamless enhancement of the auditory spatial processing that had been identified as the core problem. The subjects who tested the later prototypes reported experiences that were qualitatively different from the earlier ones. Not two overlapping realities, but one reality that felt clearer, more defined. They could locate sounds more accurately. They could respond to warning signals faster. The data supported what they were reporting. The technology was working, but the technology was also doing something else, something that showed up in the data before it fully showed up in the subjective reports. Subjects who had used the later stage prototypes for extended periods showed changes in their baseline auditory processing that persisted after the device was removed. Not dramatic changes, not the kind of changes that would show up in a standard hearing test, but measurable, statistically significant changes in the specific directional processing tasks that the project had been targeting. The brain exposed to the compensating patterns of direct resonance induction for long enough appeared to be incorporating those patterns into its own baseline processing. The technology was not just compensating for low-gravity impairment, it was, over time, rewiring the processing architecture that the compensation was designed to support. This discovery that the effects of the device persisted and accumulated beyond the period of active use was the finding that changed the trajectory of the project more sharply than anything that had come before. It opened up possibilities that the researchers had not anticipated and could not fully evaluate. If the brain was being permanently modified by the technology, then what exactly was the nature of that modification? Was it beneficial? Was it neutral? Was it potentially harmful in ways that had not yet manifested? The project had been running for long enough at this point that some subjects had accumulated years of exposure. The data from those subjects was, by the law's account, extraordinary, and not entirely in ways that were expected. Long-term subjects showed not just maintained improvement in low-gravity directional processing, they showed enhancement of auditory spatial processing in all environments, including standard gravity. Their spatial hearing had been improved across the board, not just compensated in one specific context. This was a finding that went far beyond the original mandate of the project, and far beyond anything Millet analysts had set out to create. They had started with the goal of helping workers stay safe. They had arrived at what appeared to be a genuine enhancement of human sensory capability, and that arrival point raised a set of questions that the safety research framework the project had been operating under was completely inadequate to address. The internal response to this finding, as the law suggests, was divided. Some researchers saw it as a validation of the entire project. They had been working toward better human performance in challenging environments, and they had achieved it, and then some. The fact that the enhancement generalized beyond the specific context it had been designed for was not alarming to them. It was exciting. It was evidence that they had found something real and durable, something that pointed toward a future where humans could be equipped, through technology and the adaptive power of their own neurology, to function more effectively in the extreme environments that the expansion into space demanded. Others were less certain. The researchers who expressed concern were not, by the law's account, opposed to human enhancement in principle. They were concerned about the specific mechanism by which this enhancement was occurring, and about the fact that it was occurring without the explicit awareness of the subjects involved. People had consented to use a device that would improve their directional hearing in low-gravity environments. They had not consented to permanent neurological modification. The distinction mattered, both ethically and practically. If you were going to permanently modify how someone's brain processed sensory information, you needed to know a great deal more about what you were doing before you could reasonably claim that the modification was benign. The practical concern was straightforward. What happened if you tried to reverse it? Nobody had tested that. Nobody had tried to take a long-term subject and return their auditory processing to its baseline state. The assumption had been that the effects of the device were compensatory and therefore, by definition, beneficial. But an assumption is not a study. And the longer the project ran without a rigorous investigation of reversibility, the more uncomfortable some of the researchers became. These concerns were documented. The law gives no indication that they were suppressed or hidden exactly. They appear in the records that survive from this period, which suggests that the project was not operating with the kind of overt secrecy that would have required those concerns to be buried. But there is a difference between documenting concerns and acting on them. The project continued, the timeline advanced, and the decision was made to move forward into what would become the 40th iteration, Project Echostride 40, which represented the fullest and most ambitious realization of everything the project had learned up to that point. The Stella Montis facility was selected as the primary site for Project Echostride 40. This choice was not random. Stella Montis had characteristics that made it uniquely suited to the work that the 40th iteration was designed to accomplish. It was a large, well-equipped research facility with the kind of operational history and institutional continuity that complex long-term research projects require. It had populations of workers who had been living and working in low-gravity conditions for years, which meant access to exactly the kind of long-term exposure data that the project needed. And it had a physical and logistical setup that could accommodate the specialized equipment that Project Echostride 40 would require. Stella Montis also had a culture. Every facility does, and the culture of a facility shapes the kind of research that gets done there and the way that research gets received. Stella Montis was, by the law's account, a place that took its work seriously and that had a reputation for operational excellence. People there were proud of what they did and how they did it. They were, in general, the kind of community that responds well to being told that a research program has been designed specifically to improve their working conditions. The buy-in that Project Echostride 40 needed to function, the willingness of the facility's population to participate in the research and to use the technologies being developed was easier to obtain at Stella Montis than it would have been elsewhere. The move to Stella Montis also brought the project into contact with a new set of resources and a new set of constraints. The facility had its own research staff, its own medical personnel, and its own administrative structure, all of which had opinions about what Project Echostride was doing and how it was doing it. The integration of the Echostride team with the existing Stella Montis infrastructure was not seamless. Turf questions emerged. Protocol disagreements emerged. The kind of friction that happens whenever an outside team moves into an established institution and starts doing work that touches things the institution considers its own. These frictions were managed, but the law suggests that managing them consumed energy and attention that the project could not entirely afford. Within Stella Montis, the project began deploying the technologies it had developed through the previous 39 iterations in a more systematic and comprehensive way than had ever been attempted before. The resonance headbands, which had evolved through many generations of refinement from the early compensation devices, were now distributed to workers across multiple departments. The orbital auditory amplifiers, a technology that had emerged from the project's work on extending the range and precision of auditory spatial processing, were installed at key points throughout the facility, and the monitoring systems that tracked the neurological data from subjects using these devices were running continuously, building the most comprehensive dataset the project had ever assembled. This was, in the most straightforward sense, the most ambitious thing Project Echostride had ever done. The scale was different, the depth of integration was different, the data being generated was different in both volume and complexity. The team at Stella Montis knew they were doing something that nobody had done before, and the law suggests that they felt the weight of that in ways that were both motivating and, for some of them, quietly unsettling. They were at the frontier, and at the frontier you cannot always see clearly what is ahead. Chapter 2. Melee Analyse and the Architecture of Ambition. Melee Analyse is one of those organisations that the Ark Raiders universe references frequently enough that you start to feel like you know what it is, without ever quite getting a full picture. The name appears in equipment descriptions, in facility records, in audio logs, and fragmented documents scattered across the game's world. It is clearly significant. But the lore is careful, in the way that good lore often is, not to give you everything at once. You build the picture piece by piece, and the picture you build is not a simple one. The organisation's name is itself interesting. Melee Analyse sounds like it could be a person's name, the name of a founder or a key figure. And that reading is not entirely wrong, according to what the law suggests. There are references that point toward the possibility that Melee was an individual, that the organisation was named for someone rather than assembled as an acronym or a completely invented corporate designation. Who Millet was exactly, what their role in the early history of the organization was, and what happened to them, is one of the more persistent gaps in the lore around this project. The name is present. The person, if there was a person, remains largely in shadow. What the lore does offer about Millet Analys's origins suggests an organization that started in a conventional enough space. Medical research with applications to occupational health, the kind of work that exists at the intersection of institutional funding and genuine scientific curiosity, not glamorous, but important. The early history of the organization is characterized in the surviving records by steady, careful work. They built a reputation for rigor. They published findings that other researchers could verify and build on. They were, in the language of that world, a trustworthy source. That reputation was a form of capital, and it mattered enormously when the organization began pursuing work that required people to trust them in more direct and consequential ways. The leadership structure of Millet Analys at the time of Project Echostride is not extensively documented in the lore, but certain figures emerge with enough clarity to suggest the dynamics at play. There was a scientific leadership that was genuinely absorbed in the research, people whose primary identity was as researchers, and who evaluated the project's progress primarily in terms of what it was discovering. And there was an administrative and strategic leadership that was equally absorbed in a different set of questions. What the project meant for the organization's position, its funding, its relationships with the facilities and governing bodies that determined its ability to operate. These two leadership cultures coexisted in a way that was, for a long time, productive. The scientists produced results. The strategists secured the resources and relationships that allowed the scientists to keep producing results. Each group needed the other, and each group understood that, even if they did not always speak the same language or share the same priorities. Project Echostride was, in its early phases, a success story for both. The science was advancing, the organizational position was improving. The feedback loop between research achievement and resource acquisition was working exactly as it was supposed to. The tension between these two cultures became more pronounced as the project moved into its later iterations. The scientific discoveries were getting harder to present in straightforwardly positive terms. The finding that long-term use of the resonance technology was producing persistent neurological changes, while scientifically fascinating, was not the kind of clean success story that the strategic leadership could easily bring to funders and facility administrators. It required nuance. It required careful explanation. And nuance and careful explanation are harder to sell than simple success. The response of Millet Analys's strategic leadership to this tension is one of the more revealing aspects of what the lore has to say about the organization. They did not, as far as the records suggest, attempt to hide or distort the scientific findings, but they did make choices about how to present them, which aspects to lead with and which to leave for later, which questions to invite, and which to gently discourage. These are not unusual choices for an organization managing complex stakeholder relationships. They are the kinds of choices that every organization with a research program and a public face makes constantly. But they have consequences. They shape what people outside the organization understand about what the organization is doing. And in the case of Project Echostride 40, what people outside understood was significantly less complicated than the reality inside. The specific individuals most closely associated with the scientific direction of Project Echostride 40 at Stella Montis appear in the lore with varying levels of clarity. Some are named directly in documents and equipment records. Others are present only as initials, as references to positions rather than people, as the kind of trace evidence that suggests someone was there without telling you much about who they were. The fragmentary nature of this record is consistent with what one might expect from an organization that had reasons to be careful about how its work was documented, or from a facility that experienced the kind of disruption that would naturally leave records incomplete. One pattern that does emerge from the law is a consistent emphasis within Millet analyses on what they called applied benefit. This phrase appears in multiple documents associated with the organization, and it seems to have functioned as something like an internal philosophical commitment, a touchstone that the organization returned to when justifying its direction. Applied benefit meant that research had to connect to real-world improvements in human life, that the point of understanding something was to use that understanding to make things better for people. It was, in isolation, a perfectly reasonable and even admirable principle. The complication is that it can function as a way of pre-justifying research directions before you know enough about them to actually evaluate their benefit. If you are committed to the principle that your research will be beneficial, then findings that complicate that picture become harder to take seriously as warnings. They become obstacles to navigate rather than signals to heed. The law suggests that this dynamic played out within Project Echostride in ways that are worth paying attention to. The researchers who raised concerns about the neurological persistence effects were not dismissed exactly. But the organizational culture's commitment to applied benefit may have made it structurally harder to treat those concerns as the serious red flags they were. The presumption was in favor of the work continuing. The burden of proof fell on those who wanted to slow it down. Millet analyses relationship with the broader institutional landscape of ARC raiders is complex enough that it could be its own video. The organization did not operate in isolation. It depended on relationships with facility operators, with whatever governing and regulatory structures existed in this universe, with the communities of workers and researchers who were both the subjects of its work and, in many cases, voluntary participants in it. Those relationships shaped the project in ways that the internal records of Millet analyses alone cannot fully capture. Understanding Echostride fully means understanding not just what Millet analyses did, but how they existed in relation to everything around them. The funding model for Project Echostride, as the law presents it, was mixed. There were institutional sources, bodies with interests in the safety and performance of low-gravity facilities who saw value in supporting the work. There were also arrangements that looked more like direct partnerships with facility operators, including arrangements that gave those operators certain rights to the technologies being developed and certain influence over the direction of the research. The Stella Montis facilities relationship with Millet analyses appears to have been in this second category. It was not simply a research site where a team came to work. It was, in some meaningful sense, a stakeholder, and stakeholders have opinions. The nature of Stella Montis's stakeholder role in Project Echostride 40 is one of the things that the law points toward without fully explaining. What seems clear is that the facility had interests in the project that went beyond a general desire to see worker safety improved. There was something specific about what Echostride 40 was doing, something about the scale or the depth of the integration it was pursuing that made Stella Montis's administrative leadership more than a passive host. They were, in some sense, invested, and invested parties tend to want results. The pressure that creates, subtle but real, is worth keeping in mind when thinking about why the project moved in the directions it did. Within the organizational culture of Millet analyses at this period, there was what the law describes, through accumulated documentary evidence, as an atmosphere of urgency. Not the frantic urgency of a crisis, but the quieter urgency of people who believe they are close to something important and do not want to lose momentum. This kind of urgency is one of the most powerful forces in research environments. It is motivating. It creates cohesion and shared purpose. It also narrows the field of vision. When you're close to a breakthrough, the things that might give you pause feel like distractions. The critical voice in the room becomes the person who does not understand how significant the work is. The technologies that Project Echostride 40 was developing did not emerge from this organizational context without being shaped by it. The resonance headbands and the orbital auditory amplifiers were not neutral scientific instruments. They were products of a specific research culture, a specific set of priorities, a specific relationship between the people developing them and the people they were developed for. Understanding the technology means understanding all of that. It means understanding Analyze not just as a research organization, but as a human institution with all the complexity and contradiction that implies. The resonance headbands, which we will examine in much more detail later in this video, were the most direct expression of what Analyze had learned through the project's development arc. They were the personal scale technology, the thing that an individual worker wore and experienced and depended on. As they evolved through the project's iterations, they became increasingly sophisticated, not just as pieces of engineering, but as expressions of a particular vision of the relationship between technology and the human body. That vision was Analyze's vision. It was shaped by their research history, their organizational culture, their commitments, and their blind spots. The headbands were, in a sense, a materialization of everything the organization believed. The orbital auditory amplifiers operated at a different scale. Where the headbands were personal, the amplifiers were environmental. They were installed in facilities integrated into the physical infrastructure of places like Stellarmontis, and they operated continuously, shaping the acoustic environment in ways that interacted with the headbands and with the auditory processing of everyone in the facility, whether they were wearing a headband or not. The distinction between the personal scale and the environmental scale is not just technical, it is ethical. Installing something in a personal device requires the consent of the person wearing it. Installing something in the environment raises harder questions about who has the authority to consent on behalf of everyone who lives and works in that environment. Analyze navigated those harder questions in the ways that organizations with strong institutional commitments and good intentions usually do. By focusing on the benefits, by consulting with the people most directly affected at the facility level, and by treating the institutional approvals that were obtained as equivalent to the individual consent that was, in practice, much harder to secure. The records from Stellarmontis suggest that the installation of the orbital auditory amplifiers was presented to the facility's population as an improvement to the working environment, a positive change, something to be welcomed. The framing was not inaccurate exactly, but it was incomplete in ways that, in hindsight, matter. The scientific work itself, the actual research that Analyze was doing at Stellarmontis under the Project Echostride 40 designation, was by all available accounts genuinely impressive. The data they were generating was advancing the understanding of human auditory processing in low-gravity environments in ways that had not been possible before. The methodologies they were developing were innovative. The technologies they were producing were, by the metrics they were measuring, effective. The project was achieving what it had set out to achieve, and then more than that. In purely scientific terms, it was succeeding. But success in science is complicated. A finding is not just a fact. It is a fact embedded in a context, and the context shapes what the fact means and what it implies. Project Echostride 40 was generating findings that were extraordinary in their implications, findings that went far beyond the original question of worker safety in low-gravity environments and pointed towards something much larger. The question of what to do with those findings, how to communicate them, how to manage them, how to decide whether they were cause for celebration or cause for concern, was a question that Analyze was not fully prepared to answer. Not because they were incompetent or malicious, but because nothing in their history as an organization had equipped them for this particular frontier. The decisions made at this stage, the choices about what to pursue and what to pause, what to reveal and what to hold back, what to accelerate and what to subject to more careful scrutiny were decisions made by human beings under pressure. Researchers who had spent years on this work and believed deeply in its value, administrators who had committed the organization's resources and reputation to the project's success, facility operators who had made investments, literal and political, in the outcomes. These were not people making decisions in a vacuum. They were people embedded in webs of obligation and expectation and genuine conviction about what they were doing and why it mattered. That is, in the end, what makes the story of Mile Analyse and Project Echostride interesting. It is not a story about villains. It is not a story about people who set out to do something harmful and did it. It is a story about people who set out to do something good, who succeeded at a level beyond their own expectations, and who found themselves, as a result, in a place that neither their ethics nor their expertise had fully prepared them to navigate. The Ark Raiders universe is full of stories like that. Stories about the gap between intention and consequence, between what people meant to do and what they actually created. Project Echostride 40 is one of the clearest examples of that gap in the entire lore. The organizational history of Milo Analyse after Project Echostride 40 is, like so much else in this universe, fragmentary. What can be inferred from the surviving records and in-game references is that the organization's relationship with the project's outcomes was complicated. There were elements of what the project produced that became part of Mile Analyse's legacy in ways that appear to be officially acknowledged, absorbed into the organization's record as achievement. And there were other elements that appear in the record in ways that are more ambiguous, more circumspect, referenced without the kind of clear framing that would make it obvious whether they are being celebrated or managed. That ambiguity is perhaps the most honest thing the lore can offer about an organization that was genuinely complex. Mile Analyse was not simply good or simply bad. It was an institution that did significant work, some of it clearly beneficial, some of it clearly consequential, in ways that went beyond what was planned, and all of it deeply human in the way that it mixed genuine care with genuine blindness. The Ark Raiders universe, at its best, does not give you easy moral readings. It gives you situations that require you to think. Mile Analyse and Project Echostride is exactly that kind of situation. The specific question of what Mile Analyse knew, when they knew it, and what they did with what they knew is one that the lore leaves deliberately open. There are documents that suggest awareness of the more unsettling implications of the project's findings at a relatively early stage. There are also documents that suggest those implications were understood in different ways by different people within the organization, that the internal conversation was not a simple case of some people knowing the truth and hiding it from others. The picture is messier than that, and messier is almost always more accurate when you're dealing with real institutions and the decisions they make under pressure. Project Echostride 40 did not happen in a day or a year. It was the product of a sustained institutional commitment that outlasted personnel changes, funding cycles, facility transitions, and the accumulated weight of what was being discovered. The people who finished it were not entirely the same people who started it. The organization that completed it had been shaped by the journey of getting there in ways that the organization at the beginning could not have anticipated. That evolution, from the safety-focused research group that first proposed the project to the organization that deployed full-scale resonance technology at Stella Montis, is itself one of the most important parts of the story. One thing that the lore is fairly consistent about, across the various fragments and references that touch on Mile Analyse, is that the organization genuinely believed in what it was doing. The belief is palpable in the language of the records, in the way researchers describe their work and its purpose, in the care that clearly went into the design of both the technologies and the research protocols. This was not cynical work done by people who did not care about the outcomes. It was earnest work done by people who cared perhaps too much, in the specific way that caring too much about a goal can sometimes make you less careful about the means of achieving it. The organizational culture of Mille Analyses was, in the law's presentation, one that placed high value on achievement and on the practical application of knowledge. These are excellent values for a research organization. They are also values that can, under the right pressures, produce an environment where the voice that says, "Wait, are we sure about this?" gets heard a little less clearly than it should. Not because that voice is silenced, but because the cultural current runs so strongly in a different direction that swimming against it requires more than most people in an institution are able to sustain. This is the organizational story behind Project Echostride 40. It is a story about what happens when a genuinely capable and genuinely well-intentioned research organization follows the logic of its own best work to a place that its moral and institutional frameworks were not ready for. The science is extraordinary, the intentions are good, the consequences are complicated, and Mille Analyses is left holding something that does not fit neatly into any of the categories it had prepared for. That is, in the Ark Raiders universe, as in the real world, a very familiar kind of story. And it is only the beginning of what Project Echostride 40 is about. The specific moment when Mille Analyses' internal culture began to show the most strain is pointed to in the law by a series of records from the Stella Montis period that show an unusual pattern of personnel transfers. Researchers who had been closely involved with the project for extended periods were moved to different assignments, sometimes within the project, sometimes out of it entirely. The reasons given in the official records are generic, the kind of language that gets used when the real reasons are things that organizations prefer not to document explicitly. Rotation, for development purposes. Resource reallocation. Position restructuring. The pattern taken as a whole suggests that something in the project's internal dynamics was creating a need to manage certain people and their concerns in ways that went beyond normal personnel administration. The researchers who were transferred were not, as far as the law suggests, individuals who had been loudly disruptive or who had taken their concerns outside the organization. They were, in the main, people who had raised questions through internal channels, who had written memos and requested reviews, and asked for the kind of additional scrutiny that the project's findings arguably warranted. The transfers did not silence those questions exactly. They diluted them. They separated the people, asking them from the contexts in which they were most relevant. And they sent a signal, not a loud one, but a legible one, about what kinds of internal advocacy were and were not compatible with staying closely involved with the project's most significant work. The effect of this pattern on the research itself is hard to measure precisely, because you cannot run the counterfactual. You cannot know what Project Echostride 40 would have looked like if the skeptical voices had remained more consistently present throughout its most ambitious phase. What you can say, based on the law's account, is that the project in its final form was shaped by a particular set of commitments and priorities, and that the process by which it arrived at those commitments involved the gradual removal of the most persistent sources of internal friction. That is not a conspiracy. It is an organizational dynamic, but it is one with consequences. The legacy of Mille Analyses as an organization is inextricable from the legacy of Project Echostride. What they built at Stella Montis, what they demonstrated was possible, and what they left behind when the project reached its end, or at least when the records about it become sparse and ambiguous, is the fullest expression of what the organization was capable of and what it was willing to do. Understanding Mille Analyses means sitting with that legacy in its full complexity, which is exactly what the best Ark Raiders law invites you to do. Chapter 3. The Stella Montis Facility. Stella Montis is a name that carries weight in the Ark Raiders universe. It appears in enough contexts, is referenced with enough specificity, and is associated with enough significant events that it functions as something more than a setting. It is almost a character. The facility has a personality that comes through in the accumulated details of its representation in the lore, a sense of what kind of place it is and what it has been through, and what it means in the larger story of this world. Understanding Project Echostride 40 requires understanding Stella Montis, because the project and the facility shaped each other in ways that go beyond a simple host and guest relationship. The name itself, Stella Montis, is evocative. It is Latin-derived, suggesting star and mountain, a combination that implies elevation and aspiration, and the kind of reaching upward that characterizes the broader project of off-world expansion in this universe. Names chosen for facilities in this kind of universe often carry intentional symbolic weight, chosen by the people who establish them to communicate something about purpose and identity. Stella Montis, as a name, communicates a certain kind of ambition. It says this is a place that looks upward, that operates at the edge of things, that takes seriously the work of pushing beyond what came before. The physical configuration of Stella Montis, as described in the lore, is consistent with the kind of research and operational facility that would be built for long-term habitation and complex scientific work in a low-gravity environment. It is large enough to support a substantial population. It has the infrastructure, the life support systems, the power generation, the communication arrays, the specialized research spaces that a project like Echostride would require. It is also built in a way that reflects the understanding gained from earlier, less successful approaches to low-gravity facility design. The acoustic management systems built into its construction were, from early in its history, more sophisticated than what had been standard in previous generations of facilities. This acoustic sophistication is one of the reasons Stella Montis was attractive to Project Echostride. The facility was not a blank slate in terms of sensory management. It was a site that had already been designed with auditory conditions in mind, which meant that the researchers arriving to conduct Project Echostride 40 were not starting from zero. They had a foundation to build on, and they had access to the design records and operational data from Stella Montis' history that allowed them to understand that foundation in detail. The baseline was better here than almost anywhere else the project could have gone, which meant that the enhancements Echostride was developing could be evaluated against a clearer standard. The population of Stella Montis at the time of Project Echostride 40 is described in the lore in terms that suggest a community rather than simply a workforce. People lived there in a sustained way, not just rotating through on short deployments. There were social structures, relationships, histories, identities built around the shared experience of being part of this facility. This matters for understanding how Project Echostride integrated with the human context of the place. The research was not being conducted on interchangeable test subjects in a sterile experimental environment. It was being conducted on members of a community, people who had relationships with each other and with the facility itself, who had opinions and preferences, and the kind of collective culture that develops in any group of people who spend significant time together. The community culture of Stella Montis, as the lore presents it, had a strong orientation toward competence and capability. People there took pride in being good at their work. The facility's reputation for operational excellence was not just an administrative achievement, it was something the people living and working there felt personally. This cultural orientation meant that the prospect of sensory enhancement technology, something that could make them objectively better at the tasks that defined their professional identity, was not viewed with the skepticism that it might have been encountered with elsewhere. The Echostride technologies were, in the framing of that culture, tools for being better at what you were already good at. That framing resonated. The administrative structure of Stella Montis had its own institutional interests and its own perspective on what Project Echostride 40 meant. The facility's leadership was aware, more explicitly than the general population was, of the full scope of what the project was attempting. They had access to information about the neurological persistence findings that had not been broadly communicated to the facility's residents. They had been involved in the discussions about the orbital auditory amplifiers and what their installation would mean for everyone in the facility. They had made decisions about all of this, and the law suggests that those decisions were made with a combination of genuine commitment to the facility's welfare and a calculation about what the project's success would mean for Stella Montis's institutional position. Facilities in the Ark Raiders universe are not neutral spaces. They have political significance. They have relationships with the various powers and factions that shape this world. Being the site of a significant and successful research program, being associated with a genuine scientific breakthrough, is a form of institutional capital. Stella Montis's decision to host Project Echostride 40 and to facilitate it as fully as it did was not purely altruistic. It was also a strategic choice made by an institution that understood the value of being at the center of something important. This does not make the decision wrong. It makes it human. Institutions make strategic choices all the time. But understanding those choices helps you understand why things happened the way they did. The physical spaces within Stella Montis that were specifically dedicated to Project Echostride 40 are referenced in the law with enough detail to give a sense of their character. The research areas were not the standard laboratory configuration of most research facilities. They had been adapted to accommodate the specific needs of sensory research in a live operational environment. There were spaces designed for testing auditory performance under controlled but realistic conditions. There were monitoring stations where the neurological data from subjects using the resonance technology was tracked and analysed in real time. And there were what the records describe as integration suites, spaces specifically designed for the calibration and initial use of the resonance headbands by new participants, where the technology was introduced to individuals in a controlled and monitored environment. The integration suites are one of the more interesting physical details in the law about Stella Montis. The care that went into their design suggests an awareness on the part of the project's researchers that the initial experience of using the resonance technology was important. First impressions in this case were not just about comfort and convenience. The way a person's brain first encountered and began to integrate the direct resonance induction signals likely shaped the longer-term patterns of how that integration developed. Getting it right the first time was not just a quality of experience issue, it was a scientific one, and the integration suites reflect that understanding in their design. The day-to-day operations of Project Echostride 40 at Stella Montis involved a level of coordination between the research team and the facility's regular operations that required constant management. The research was not taking place in a sealed-off section of the facility, separate from the real work being done there. It was embedded in that real work. Workers were using the resonance headbands in the course of their actual jobs, not in simulated test conditions. The orbital auditory amplifiers were running continuously in the facility's operational spaces. The line between research environment and living environment was, by design, thin. This was a methodological choice by the project's researchers, because ecological validity, testing the technology in conditions that matched real use, produced better data than controlled laboratory conditions. But it also meant that the research was unavoidably entangled with the lives of the people at the facility in ways that a more conventional research setup would not have been. This entanglement produced some of the most valuable data the project ever generated. The real-world performance of the resonance technology, tracked against actual operational outcomes in a live facility, gave the researchers information that no amount of laboratory simulation could have provided. They could see in real time how the technology was affecting the people using it and the facility as a whole. They could observe unexpected interactions and unexpected benefits and unexpected complications in ways that a more isolated research environment would have filtered out. The data was rich, the data was complicated, and the data was producing a picture of what Project Echostride 40 was actually doing that was more nuanced and in some ways more unsettling than the project's designers had anticipated. Stella Montis itself began to change as Project Echostride 40 moved through its phases. The changes were not dramatic, at least not in ways that the facility's population fully recognized at the time. They were changes in the texture of daily experience, the way sounds landed and resolved in the facility's spaces, the way people navigated the acoustic environment, the way interactions between colleagues in high-noise work contexts felt easier or harder depending on which technologies were active and how long individuals had been using them. These were subtle changes, the kind that you notice only in retrospect or when someone points them out. But they were real changes, and they were the kind of changes that, accumulated over time, add up to a different place. The law's presentation of Stella Montis at the height of Project Echostride 40 is of a facility that was functioning better, by measurable operational metrics, than it had before the project arrived. Accident rates were down, productivity markers were up, worker reported well-being in relation to the facility's acoustic environment had improved significantly. In the terms that the project had been designed to produce, it was a success, and the facility's community felt that success. They felt the improvement in their working conditions. They attributed it, correctly, to the project and its technologies. And that positive experience created the kind of institutional endorsement that made it very hard to ask uncomfortable questions without seeming like you were opposing something that was clearly working. The relationship between what was working and what was unknown is one of the central tensions in the Stella Montis story. The measurable improvements were real. The neurological changes being produced in the facility's population were also real, but less measurable in the everyday sense, less visible in the metrics that people were using to evaluate the project's performance. A gap had opened between the experience of the technology and the full reality of what the technology was doing. And in that gap, questions that deserved to be asked were not being asked loudly enough to change the direction of what was happening. The orbital auditory amplifiers installed throughout Stella Montis were a key part of this story. They were not passive equipment. They were active systems, continuously generating and modulating acoustic patterns that interacted with the resonance headbands and, over time, with the baseline auditory processing of everyone in the facility. The law is careful in how it describes their function, using language that points toward rather than definitively states the nature of their influence. What seems clear is that the amplifiers were doing something beyond simple acoustic management. They were part of the larger system that Project Echostride 40 had built, and they were contributing to the cumulative effects that the project was producing, effects that went beyond what any individual component of the system would have produced alone. The interaction between the headbands and the amplifiers, and between both of those and the human beings in the facility, created what the project's researchers referred to in their internal documents as a resonance ecology. This phrase captures something important. An ecology is a system, a set of dynamic relationships between elements that cannot be fully understood by looking at each element in isolation. The resonance ecology of Stella Montis was the totality of acoustic and neurological interactions that Project Echostride 40 had created in that environment. And like any ecology, it had emergent properties, things that arose from the interactions of the system's parts that had not been explicitly designed or predicted. The emergent properties of the Stella Montis resonance ecology are among the more fascinating and ambiguous elements of the Project Echostride 40 law. Some of them were clearly beneficial, extensions and amplifications of the improvements the project had been designed to produce. Others were less clearly classifiable. They were phenomena that the project's researchers observed and documented, but did not fully understand, effects that sat outside the categories they had built their research around, and required new frameworks to even describe adequately. The willingness to confront those phenomena honestly, to acknowledge that the system was producing things that had not been expected and were not fully understood, is one of the places where the law's account of Project Echostride 40 becomes most interesting. Because confronting unexpected phenomena honestly is harder than it sounds. When you are embedded in an institutional context that has significant investment in a particular narrative about what you are doing, the narrative that Project Echostride 40 was a safety enhancement project producing measurable improvements in worker performance was true as far as it went. But it did not go far enough to capture what was actually happening at Stellarmontis by the time the project reached its most advanced phase. And the gap between the official narrative and the full reality of what was happening was something that different people in the project experienced very differently. The workers at Stellarmontis, the people most directly affected by what the project was doing, were experiencing the effects of the resonance ecology from the inside. Their experience was shaped by the improvements they could feel and measure, by the ways their working environment had genuinely gotten better. But it was also shaped by things they could not fully articulate, subtle shifts in how they perceived and processed their environment that they lacked the conceptual framework to describe. Some of them described it in ways that sound, in retrospect, like early accounts of what the neurological persistence data was showing. Without knowing what they were describing, the researchers observing the facility knew more than the workers, but not everything. They had the data, they had the theoretical frameworks, but they were also embedded in the organizational culture of the project, which had its own momentum and its own way of interpreting what was being seen. The data was real. The interpretation of the data was shaped by context, by expectation, by institutional pressure. Understanding where the data ended and the interpretation began is one of the ongoing challenges in reading the Stellarmontis records, and it is one of the reasons why the lore around Project Echostride 40 rewards careful attention. The physical layout of Stellarmontis, the way the orbital auditory amplifiers were positioned within its spaces, the way the integration suites were situated in relation to the residential and operational areas, the way the monitoring infrastructure was embedded in the facility's daily environment, all of this suggests a degree of planning and intentionality that is, in itself, worth reflecting on. Whoever designed the integration of Project Echostride 40 into Stellarmontis was thinking carefully about how the technology would interact with the facility and its population. The design reflects a sophisticated understanding of the project's goals and methods. It also reflects a particular vision of what the relationship between the technology and the people should be, a vision that the lore invites you to evaluate as part of understanding what the project was really about. Stellarmontis, at the height of Project Echostride 40, was something that no facility in this universe had ever been before. It was a place where the line between the research environment and the lived environment had been deliberately and systematically blurred. It was a place where the acoustic and neurological experience of the population was being continuously shaped by technologies that most of the people in it understood only partially. It was a place that was, in a very real sense, an experiment in what it would mean to live inside the research project rather than alongside it. And it was, by the metrics that were being used to evaluate it, a successful experiment. The questions that success leaves unanswered are the questions that make this story worth telling. Chapter 4: The Science of Resonance. The scientific principles underlying Project Echostride 40 are dense enough that they deserve their own chapter, not because this is a science lecture, but because the specific things the project was trying to do at the level of physics and biology matter for understanding what it achieved and what it produced that nobody had planned for. The law presents this science in fragments, in equipment descriptions and technical documents, and the kind of incidental detail that appears in well-crafted fictional universes when the creators have done their homework. Assembling those fragments into a coherent picture requires some reconstruction, and this is one of the places where I am presenting an interpretation rather than a direct reading of stated canon. The starting point for the science is the inner ear. The human inner ear is a remarkably sophisticated piece of biological engineering, responsible for both hearing and balance. The cochlea handles hearing. The vestibular system handles balance. These two functions are not independent. They share the same fluid environment, the same neural pathways, and the same fundamental mechanisms. This coupling is generally invisible in everyday life, because the conditions in which humans evolved kept both systems operating in consistent gravitational conditions where the coupling was not a problem. In low gravity, the coupling becomes significant. The vestibular system relies on the movement of fluid and tiny calcium carbonate crystals, called otoliths, to detect changes in head orientation and movement relative to gravity. In reduced gravity, the behavior of both the fluid and the otoliths changes. The fluid dynamics are different. The otoliths, which are calibrated to a specific range of gravitational pull, behave differently when that pull is reduced. The vestibular system continues to generate information about orientation and movement, but the information it generates is no longer correctly calibrated to the actual gravitational environment. It is, in a very specific technical sense, giving the brain data that was correct for conditions that no longer apply. The brain does not receive this data passively. It integrates it with inputs from other sensory systems, from vision, from proprioception, from auditory cues, to build a coherent model of the body's position and movement in space. When the vestibular data is miscalibrated, the integration process is disrupted. The brain is trying to reconcile inputs that do not fully agree with each other, and the result is the spatial uncertainty that low-gravity workers had been describing for years before Project Echostride began studying it systematically. It is not just that they feel slightly off balance, it is that their brain's spatial model of the world is being built from inputs that do not cohere correctly. Auditory spatial processing is one of the inputs that the brain uses in building that model. The ability to locate sounds in space depends on the brain's integration of vestibular data, auditory data, and head orientation information. When the vestibular component of that integration is degraded, the auditory spatial processing degrades with it. This is the mechanism that Project Echostride's early research had identified and that all of the project's subsequent work was trying to address. The question was how to restore or compensate for the vestibular contribution to auditory spatial processing in conditions where the vestibular system itself was operating outside its calibrated range. The approach that eventually proved most productive was not, as some of the project's early iterations had assumed, a matter of compensating for the vestibular signal. It was a matter of giving the brain a different reference frame. The vestibular system was not broken in low gravity. It was working exactly as it was designed to work, in conditions that did not match those for which it had been designed. The problem was the mismatch, not the mechanism. If you could give the brain an alternative reference frame that correctly described the low-gravity environment, the brain could use that reference frame to recalibrate its integration of the vestibular and auditory inputs, and the spatial processing would improve. Direct resonance induction was the method Millet Analyze developed for providing that alternative reference frame. The theoretical basis, as the law presents it, involves the use of precisely calibrated acoustic resonance patterns to stimulate neural pathways associated with spatial processing in specific targeted ways. The resonance patterns are not sounds in the conventional sense. They are not things you hear with your ears in the normal way. They operate at a level below conscious auditory experience, interacting with the neural substrate of the processing system rather than with the perceptual output of that system. The analogy would be the difference between showing someone a picture of a room versus adjusting the lighting in the room. Both affect what they see, but in fundamentally different ways. The resonance headbands were the delivery mechanism for this approach. Their design reflects the specific requirements of direct resonance induction, the need for precise spatial positioning relative to the auditory and vestibular structures of the inner ear, the need for continuous calibration to the individual wearer's neurological profile, and the need for the resonance patterns to be modulated in real time based on the wearer's activity and the specific acoustic conditions of the environment they were in. These are demanding requirements, and the engineering of the headbands to meet them was one of the most technically challenging aspects of the entire project. The calibration process for the resonance headbands was one of the things that distinguished later iterations from earlier ones. Early versions had used fixed resonance patterns, calibrated once during setup, and then applied continuously without adjustment. This approach produced inconsistent results because individual neurological profiles varied significantly, and a fixed pattern calibrated for an average response would be suboptimal for most individuals and potentially counterproductive for some. The discovery that real-time calibration, based on continuous monitoring of the wearer's neurological state, produced dramatically more consistent and effective results was one of the key advances that the project's middle iterations achieved. Real-time calibration required real-time monitoring. The resonance headbands in their mature form were not just output devices. They were also sensors, continuously reading the neurological state of the wearer and using that information to adjust the resonance patterns they were generating. The coupling between sensing and output, between reading the system and adjusting the input to the system, is what made the direct resonance induction approach effective. But it is also what made it something more than a simple, assistive device. A device that continuously reads and responds to your neurological state is, in a non-trivial sense, integrated with that state in ways that a purely output-directed device is not. This integration is what the project's researchers mean when they describe the resonance headbands as creating a closed-loop system. The loop runs from the wearer's neurological state through the device's sensors to the resonance pattern generator and back to the wearer's neurological state, continuously. The wearer is not just receiving input from the device. The wearer's own neurological responses are shaping what the device does next, and the device's outputs are shaping what the wearer's neurological responses will be. This loop, running continuously over extended periods, is the mechanism through which the neurological persistence effects that the project documented were produced. Understanding the persistence effects requires understanding the concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize its own structure and function in response to experience. Neuroplasticity is the mechanism behind learning, behind the adaptation to new environments, behind the recovery from neurological injury. It is, in the most fundamental sense, how the brain changes itself. What Project Echostride 40 had discovered, whether or not this was the intention, was a way of driving neuroplastic change in a specific domain of brain function, auditory spatial processing, using the closed-loop resonance technology it had developed. The persistence effects were not random. They followed patterns that were consistent with directed neuroplastic change in the specific neural pathways associated with auditory spatial processing. The brain was not changing in ways that were diffuse or unpredictable. It was changing in the specific directions that the resonance patterns were designed to support. The technology was, in effect, a tool for targeted neurological modification. And while this had been discussed in theoretical terms in the early stages of the project's development, encountering it as an empirical reality, documented in real subjects who had used the technology for real periods of time, was a different experience from theorizing about it. The orbital auditory amplifiers operated at a different technical level, but within the same theoretical framework. Where the headbands worked by directly influencing individual neurological processing, the amplifiers worked by shaping the acoustic environment itself in ways that were designed to support and enhance the effects of the headbands, and over time to produce effects in the general population of the facility, including people who were not wearing headbands. The mechanism for the latter was more indirect and relied on a phenomenon that the project's researchers called resonance entrainment. Resonance entrainment, as the law describes it, is a process by which repeated exposure to specific acoustic resonance patterns, even below the threshold of conscious hearing, can influence the baseline patterns of neural activity in auditory processing regions of the brain. The theory, which the project's empirical data was supporting, is that the brain's auditory processing systems are not just passive receivers of acoustic input. They are active systems that tune themselves to the acoustic environments they are regularly exposed to. The orbital auditory amplifiers were, in effect, training the acoustic environment of Stella Montis to produce the specific resonance patterns that the project had identified as supportive of enhanced auditory spatial processing. This is where the distinction between individual consent and environmental influence becomes scientifically significant, not just ethically significant. A person wearing a resonance headband has, in some meaningful sense, chosen to use that technology. The closed-loop system is operating on them specifically, calibrated to their individual neurological profile, because they are wearing the device. A person in a facility with orbital auditory amplifiers installed has not made any specific choice about exposure to resonance entrainment. The environment they are in is producing those effects continuously, whether they are aware of it or not, whether they have consented to it or not, and without the individual calibration that the headbands provided. The implications of resonance entrainment as an environmental phenomenon are extensive. If the amplifiers were producing measurable effects on the auditory processing of the general population at Stella Montis, then the project had moved well beyond the domain of individual enhancement technology and into something that looks more like environmental modification of a population's neurological function. This is not a small distinction, and the law's account of how this was handled, both within the project and within the facility administration, is one of the more revealing aspects of the whole story. The scientific rationale that the project's researchers used to justify the amplifier's environmental effects was, in their framing, continuous with the rest of the project's work. The effects being produced were beneficial. They were the same kinds of improvements in auditory spatial processing that the headbands were producing on an individual level. The fact that they were occurring without individual calibration meant the effects were less precise and less powerful than those produced by the headbands, but they were in the same direction. In a facility where the goal was to improve the auditory performance of the entire population, producing even modest improvements across the full population was, in the project's framing, a good thing. This rationale is coherent. It is also, when examined carefully, doing a lot of work. It is taking the quality of the effect, its direction, and its apparent benefit, and using that quality to address a question that is fundamentally about process, about the rights of individuals to know about and consent to things being done to their neurological function. A beneficial effect imposed without consent is not the same thing as a beneficial effect chosen. The difference matters, and the project's scientific rationale does not fully bridge it. The law seems aware of this tension in the way that it presents the scientific case without fully endorsing it, pointing toward it as a possible reading rather than a definitive one. The interaction between the headbands and the amplifiers produced what the project's researchers called the resonance cascade. This is not a dramatic term, despite how it might sound. In their usage, a cascade refers to a sequential amplification of effects, where each element of the system reinforces and extends the effects of the other elements. The headbands enhanced individual processing. The amplifiers supported and entrained the broader population. The improvements in individual processing among headband users changed the way they interacted with the acoustic environment, which changed the acoustic environment in ways that the amplifiers then incorporated into their ongoing calibration. The system was, in this sense, self-reinforcing. It was getting better at doing what it did the more it ran. A self-reinforcing system is a powerful thing. It is also a thing that is not easy to stop once it has started. The resonance cascade at Stellar was, by the project's metrics, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was improving auditory performance across the facility in a sustained and accelerating way. But a system that reinforces its own effects, that adjusts itself toward greater efficiency in producing those effects, will not stop at a predetermined point just because that point was never built into its design. The cascade did not have an off switch, or rather, it had switches that could turn off individual components, the headbands could be removed, the amplifiers could be deactivated. But the neurological changes those components had already produced, the persistent modifications in the brains of the people in the facility, would not reverse simply because the technology was turned off. That was what the persistence data was showing, and that created a situation that nobody in the project had a fully adequate plan for. The science of resonance, as Project Echostride 40 developed it, was genuinely impressive. It was innovative. It represented a real advance in understanding the relationship between acoustic physics, vestibular function, and neurological processing that had not existed before the project's work. The theoretical frameworks it developed, the empirical data it generated, the technologies it produced, all of these are significant contributions in the universe's law, contributions that other research would have to engage with and build on. The scientific achievement is not in question. What is in question, and what the law consistently points you toward questioning, is the relationship between the scientific achievement and the full set of consequences it produced. The science did not exist in isolation from the institutional context that produced it, from the ethical decisions that shaped how it was pursued and how its results were managed. Understanding the science fully means understanding all of that context, not as an excuse or a condemnation, but as an essential part of the story of what Project Echostride 40 was and what it meant. The resonance cascade, the emergent properties of the Stellar resonance ecology, the persistence effects in the facility's population, these are the places where the science of Echostride most directly meets the human story of what happened at Stellar. They are the places where the technical and the ethical and the personal all come together in ways that cannot be disentangled without losing something essential. The science explains the mechanism explains what happened to the people, and what happened to the people is the heart of the story. The specific findings about resonance entrainment and its effects on populations who had not individually consented to the technology, findings that the project had documented carefully in its internal records, are the most significant aspect of the amplifier's operation from an ethical standpoint. But they are also, from a scientific standpoint, the most extraordinary. The idea that an acoustic environment could be deliberately shaped to produce measurable neurological changes in its inhabitants, changes that were consistent and directional rather than random, had significant implications that went far beyond the specific context of Project Echostride 40. The implications of this finding, if taken seriously, were for every environment, every space where people lived and worked, everywhere that sound played a role in human experience, which is everywhere. This is the scale of what Project Echostride 40 was pointing toward. Not just a better set of headphones for low-gravity workers, not just an improved acoustic environment for one facility, but a fundamental insight into the relationship between sound, space, a neurological function that, if pursued, had the potential to reshape how humanity thought about the environments it built for itself. Whether that potential was recognized by the project's researchers and administrators, and whether it was a motivating factor in the decisions that were made, is one of the questions that the law leaves most deliberately open. The science, in the end, is both the project's greatest achievement and its most enduring complication. It is greatest achievement because it is genuinely, in the terms of the universe, extraordinary. It is a complication because what it reveals about what was done at Stella Montis and what could be done with this knowledge going forward does not resolve into a simple narrative of progress or failure. It resolves into a question about what science is for, who it serves, and what obligations come with the ability to change how human beings experience the world. Project Echostride 40 raised that question in the most vivid and consequential way possible, and the Ark Raiders universe characteristically does not answer it for you. Chapter 5. The Resonance Headbands. The resonance headbands are, in many ways, the most tangible element of Project Echostride 40's legacy. They are objects that appear in the Ark Raiders universe in ways that other aspects of the project do not. They can be described, depicted, referenced in equipment catalogues, found as artifacts in the game's world. They have a physical presence that the theoretical frameworks and the organizational dynamics of the project do not have. And they carry, in their design and their function and the way they are described in the lore, a great deal of information about what Project Echostride 40 was really trying to do. The design evolution of the resonance headbands across the project's iterations is itself a story. The early versions were large and conspicuous, clearly prosthetic in character, clearly something external that had been added to the person wearing them. They looked like equipment, which is what they were. They had the aesthetic of early medical technology, utilitarian and functional, making no particular effort to be anything other than what they were. The people who wore them were identified immediately as participants in the research program, which had social consequences in the community context of Stella Montes. Those social consequences shaped the design direction of subsequent iterations in ways that the project's engineers did not initially anticipate. The conspicuousness of the early headbands created a visible distinction between participants and non-participants, between people who were wearing the technology and people who were not. And this distinction was not socially neutral. It created questions about why some people were wearing them and others were not, about what the technology was doing, about whether participants had some advantage over non-participants. These questions were not necessarily hostile, but they generated a social dynamic that the project's team recognized as a potential obstacle to the broad adoption they were trying to achieve. The response to this was a deliberate effort to make later iterations of the headband less conspicuous. The design moved toward configurations that could be more easily integrated with existing workwear, that sat closer to the head, that used materials and colours that drew less visual attention. By the time the project reached its most advanced iterations, the resonance headbands had evolved from clearly identifiable research equipment to devices that could be, and in many cases were, mistaken for standard issue safety or communications equipment. This design evolution was a strategic choice, made with the explicit goal of reducing the social friction around the technology's adoption. The implications of that strategic choice are worth sitting with. When a medical or research device is designed to be inconspicuous, the reasons for that choice matter. If the goal is to make the experience of using it less stigmatizing, that is one kind of motivation. If the goal is to make it less easy for people to notice who is using it and what it is doing, that is a different kind of motivation. The law does not draw a sharp line between these motivations in the case of the resonance headbands. Both were present, and the intermingling of those motivations is part of what makes the design history of the headbands an interesting part of the larger story. The technical functioning of the resonance headbands in their mature form involves several distinct components that work together as an integrated system. The sensor array, which monitored the wearer's neurological state in real time, was distributed around the headband in a pattern optimized for reading the specific kinds of neural activity relevant to auditory spatial processing. These sensors did not make contact with the skin at scalp level in most versions, instead relying on the detection of electromagnetic signatures that could be read from a small distance. The precision of this sensing, the ability to distinguish the specific signals relevant to the project's goals from the large amount of neurological activity happening in the same regions, was one of the hardest engineering problems the project solved. The resonance generation array, the component responsible for producing the direct induction signals, was similarly sophisticated. The signals had to be delivered at precisely the right frequencies at the right intensities, with the right spatial distribution relative to the auditory and vestibular structures they were targeting. Too much variation in any of these parameters reduced the effectiveness of the induction and could produce the uncomfortable experience of competing auditory realities that the early devices had been plagued by. The engineering of the generation array to maintain the required precision across the full range of activities and environments that a worker at Stella Montis would encounter was an ongoing refinement process that spanned many iterations. The processing system that connected the sensor array to the generation array, that read the incoming neurological data and translated it in real time into calibrated resonance patterns, was in some respects the most impressive element of the entire device. It had to do this continuously, without perceptible latency, in environments that were physically demanding and that produced conditions, vibration, temperature variation, electromagnetic interference that could degrade both sensing and generation if the system was not designed to compensate for them. The processing algorithms that the project's engineers developed for this purpose were, from what the law suggests, genuinely innovative, and they drew on the project's accumulated years of data about how individual neurological profiles responded to resonance induction in different conditions. The experience of wearing the mature resonance headbands is described in the law through the subjective accounts of people who used them. These accounts are one of the more compelling aspects of the headband story because they give you the technology from the inside rather than from the outside. The consistent theme in these accounts is seamlessness. People who wore the headbands for more than a few sessions described the experience not as being augmented or enhanced, not as having an external device adding something to their perception, but as simply hearing more clearly. The spatial richness of the acoustic environment increased. Sounds that had been ambiguous in their location became clear. The cognitive effort of orienting to the acoustic environment decreased. This seamlessness is precisely what the project's researchers had been trying to achieve. The direct resonance induction approach was designed to produce the feeling of enhanced native processing rather than the feeling of an external aid, and by the accounts of users, it had succeeded. But the seamlessness also meant something that the project's more thoughtful observers noted. When a technology produces changes that feel entirely native, that feel like your own perception rather than a device you're wearing, the distinction between self and technology becomes harder to locate. People who wore the headbands for extended periods did not feel like they were using a tool. They felt like they were themselves, functioning at a level they had not previously had access to. That feeling is powerful. And when the headbands were removed, the absence of what they provided was experienced as a deficit rather than as a return to baseline. This phenomenology of deficit on removal is significant for several reasons. It suggests that the persistent neurological changes documented in the data were being felt subjectively, not just measured instrumentally. People whose brains had been modified by the resonance technology were not neutral about going back to their pre-modification state. They experienced the modified state as better as more capable, as closer to what they felt they should be, and the unmodified state, which was their baseline, which was the state they had lived in for their entire lives before the project, felt like deprivation. The ethical implications of producing this phenomenology in people who had not been fully informed about it are substantial, but they're also, in a human sense, understandable. The improved state genuinely was better in the specific domain of auditory spatial processing. The feeling of deficit on removal was not an illusion or a manipulation. It was a real response to a real change. The problem was not that the technology had failed. The problem was that the technology had succeeded so completely and in ways that embedded themselves so deeply in the user's sense of their own normal functioning that the relationship between the technology and the person wearing it had become something that the concept of consent had not been designed to handle. The project's internal discussions about what to do with this information, about how to communicate to headband users what was happening in their neurology and what it meant for their long-term relationship with the technology, are referenced in the law in ways that suggest those discussions were real, but that they did not resolve quickly or cleanly. There were researchers who argued that users had a right to know, that the persistence data needed to be shared, that the project had an obligation to be transparent about the full implications of what it was asking people to participate in. There were others who argued that sharing this information prematurely, before the project had a full understanding of what the persistence effects meant and whether they were stable and safe, would create unnecessary anxiety and potentially undermine a program that was genuinely improving people's lives. Both of these positions had merit. Both were made in good faith, and the fact that they pointed in opposite directions is exactly the kind of dilemma that research ethics exists to navigate. The mechanisms for navigating it, the oversight boards, the independent review processes, the transparency requirements that exist in well-regulated research environments are precisely the mechanisms that the project had not fully engaged in the ways that the complexity of what it was doing demanded. The size of the step between what people had consented to and what was actually happening to their neurology was larger than the project's consent frameworks had been designed for. The resonance headbands, as physical objects in the Arc Raiders universe, carry all of this history in them. They are not neutral pieces of equipment. They are artifacts of a specific moment in the universe's technological and ethical history, products of a specific set of decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances. When you encounter them in the game's world, the lore invites you to see them not just as tools, but as the physical residue of a story, objects whose design and function encode the choices and compromises and achievements and failures of Project Echostride 40. The variations in headband design across different iterations are themselves informative. The progression from large and conspicuous to small and unobtrusive maps onto the project's evolving relationship with the question of visibility and consent. The changes in the sensor arrays map onto the project's growing understanding of what neurological signals were most relevant to the effects it was trying to produce. The refinements in the generation components map onto the project's accumulating data about how to produce integrated, seamless enhancement rather than disjointed, uncomfortable augmentation. Reading the design history of the headbands is, in miniature, reading the history of the project. The question of what happened to the resonance headbands after Project Echostride 40 reached its conclusion, or its apparent conclusion, is one that the lore points toward without fully answering. Some of them clearly ended up distributed through the broader world of Arc Raiders, which is how they appear as findable objects in the game. The process by which that distribution occurred, whether it was deliberate or incidental, authorized or not, is part of the larger story of what happened when the project ended. The headbands that exist in the world of Arc Raiders are physical evidence that the project's technologies outlasted the institutional context that produced them. And what they do to the people who use them, based on everything the project discovered about how they work, is a question the law leaves open in a way that is clearly intentional. The resonance headbands are, in the final analysis, one of the most technically sophisticated and ethically complicated objects in the Ark Raiders universe. They represent the project's greatest engineering achievement and its most profound ethical complexity simultaneously. They are tools that work exactly as designed, and whose working as designed is itself the source of the complication. They are the most direct expression of what Project Echostride 40 believed it was doing, and of what it was actually doing, and of the gap between those two things that the project never fully managed to close. Chapter 6. The Orbital Auditory Amplifiers. The orbital auditory amplifiers are the component of Project Echostride 40's technological arsenal that most clearly exceeded the scope of what a safety research program should have been building. That statement requires careful qualification, because the law does not present the amplifiers as obviously malicious or as a secret project within a project. They developed, as the resonance headbands did, through a logical progression of research findings and engineering responses. But they developed into something that, in retrospect, represents a qualitatively different kind of technology than anything the project had originally intended to build. The name itself is worth unpacking. Orbital refers to their intended operational environment, specifically to spaces in or near orbital facilities, the kind of locations that Project Echostride was designed to serve from the beginning. But in the context of everything else the project built, Orbital also carries a resonance, perhaps intended, perhaps not, of something circling, surrounding, encompassing. The amplifiers were not applied to individuals the way the headbands were. They were applied to spaces and, by extension, to everyone in those spaces. Their orbital character is, in this sense, as much about their relationship to the people in their environment as it is about their physical location. The engineering origin of the orbital auditory amplifiers begins with a practical problem that the resonance headbands alone could not solve. The headbands were effective for the individuals wearing them, but they required each individual to be wearing them to benefit. In an operational facility where the goal was to improve the safety and performance of the entire workforce, this created an inherent limitation. Not everyone would always be wearing a headband. People moved between areas where headband use was standard and areas where it was not. They took them off. They forgot them. The coverage of the headband-based enhancement was, in practice, uneven and intermittent, and an uneven safety improvement in a context where the safety risks were structural and continuous was not a fully adequate solution. The initial concept for what would become the orbital auditory amplifiers was straightforward: a fixed installation that would provide acoustic support for headband users, extending and stabilizing the resonance environment that the headbands were operating in, making the headbands work more consistently and more powerfully across a wider range of conditions. The early amplifier prototypes were conceived as accessories to the headbands rather than as independent systems. They were infrastructure that made the personal technology work better. This is a well-established category in the history of assistive technology, and the concept was uncontroversial. The discovery that the amplifiers were having effects on people who were not wearing headbands was, by the accounts in the law, genuinely unexpected by the researchers who made it. The entrainment phenomenon, the way that repeated exposure to the amplifier's resonance patterns was producing measurable changes in the auditory spatial processing of people who had never used a headband, was not something that had been predicted or designed for. It emerged from the data as an artifact of the system's operation that had to be investigated and explained rather than as a designed feature. What the investigation found was that the entrainment effect, while less precise and less powerful than the changes produced by the closed-loop headband system, was real and consistent. The ambient resonance patterns being generated by the amplifiers were influencing neurological processing in anyone who spent significant time in the spaces where they were installed. The effect was dose-dependent, stronger with more exposure, and it was directional in the same way that the headband effects were directional, pushing auditory spatial processing toward the improved patterns that the project had been targeting. The decision about how to handle this discovery is where the story of the orbital auditory amplifiers becomes most significant. There were, at this point, clearly defined options available to the project. The amplifiers could have been reconfigured to reduce or eliminate the entrainment effects in their ambient operation. The discovery could have been used to prompt a broader conversation about consent and transparency with the Stella Montis population. The amplifier program could have been paused while the implications of the entrainment finding were more fully evaluated. Any of these choices would have been defensible. The choice that was made was different. The amplifiers continued to operate. The entrainment effects were documented internally and monitored, but they were not broadly communicated to the facility population. The rationale, as the law suggests it, was that the effects were beneficial and that pausing a program that was producing real safety improvements on the basis of a phenomenon that was not yet fully characterized would cause more harm than good. This reasoning follows the applied benefit logic that ran through Millet Analyse's institutional culture. The problem is that it applies that logic to a situation where the people affected had not had the opportunity to weigh in on whether the benefit justified the means. The architecture of the orbital auditory amplifiers, as they were actually deployed at Stella Montis, was designed to maximize their effectiveness as environmental resonance systems while maintaining the appearance of conventional facility equipment. The amplifier units themselves were built to resemble the kind of acoustic management hardware that facilities routinely install: systems for noise control, vibration dampening, communication infrastructure. A non-specialist walking through Stella Montis would not necessarily identify the amplifier installations as anything unusual. This design choice was justified in the project's documentation as a means of preventing the equipment from being accidentally adjusted or deactivated by facility maintenance personnel who were not part of the project. That justification is plausible. It is also consistent with a motivation to make the equipment less visible to the population being affected by it. The network of amplifiers at Stella Montis was designed to provide complete coverage of the facility's occupied spaces. The mapping of coverage zones, which appears in the project's technical documentation, shows a careful and thorough deployment that left no significant occupied area without amplifier presence. The coverage density was higher in areas where workers spent the most time, such as primary work zones and residential areas, and lower in transitional spaces. This density gradient ensured that the people most continuously present in the facility, the people who would accumulate the most exposure to the entrainment effects, were precisely the people who were most exposed to the amplifier's influence. The interaction between the amplifier network and the headband-wearing population is described in the project's technical documents using the resonance cascade terminology introduced earlier. The amplifiers created a facility-wide resonance field that interacted with the individual closed-loop systems of headband users to produce more stable and more powerful enhancement effects than either system could achieve independently. The headband users benefited from a richer and more consistent resonance environment. The ambient population benefited from the entrainment effects. The two effects were distinct in mechanism and magnitude, but pointed in the same direction. The system was designed as a totality, and as a totality, it worked. The specific frequencies and patterns used by the orbital auditory amplifiers are detailed enough in the law's technical documents to suggest that they were very carefully chosen. They were not arbitrary acoustic signals. They were specific resonance patterns that the project's years of research had identified as most effective for the particular kind of auditory spatial processing enhancement the project was targeting. The selection of those patterns and the precision with which they were implemented in the amplifier network reflects a level of technical sophistication that is consistent with the project having very clear goals for what the amplifiers were supposed to do, including their effects on people not wearing headbands. This is a detail that rewards attention. If the entrainment effect had been purely a side effect, an unintended consequence of the amplifier's operation, you would not necessarily expect the amplifiers to be calibrated with precision for exactly the frequencies most effective for neurological entrainment. The possibility that the amplifiers were designed with their environmental entrainment effects in mind, even if those effects were not foregrounded in the documentation, is one that the law leaves open. It is a possible reading, it is not a necessary reading, but it is one that the specific technical details make hard to dismiss entirely. The long-term operation of the amplifier network at Stella Montis produced effects on the facility that the monitoring data tracked carefully. The baseline auditory processing capabilities of the facility's population showed a systematic upward trend over time, consistent with cumulative entrainment effects building on themselves. The accident rates continued their decline. Performance metrics continued to improve. The facility was operating better, by every measure the project was tracking, than it had at any point in its history. And the people in the facility were, by their own accounts, experiencing their working environment as better, clearer, more navigable than it had been before. What the monitoring data was also showing, if you were looking carefully at the right tables, was the extent of the neurological changes that had accumulated in the facility's population. The ambient population, people who had never worn a headband, showed levels of auditory processing modification that, while smaller in magnitude than those in the headband-using population, were larger than the project had originally predicted for a population with only ambient exposure to the amplifiers. The entrainment effect was cumulative. It was reinforced by the resonance cascade dynamics of the whole system, and it was producing changes in people who had never specifically chosen to participate in anything. The scale of this is worth sitting with. By the time Project Echostride 40 was operating at full deployment at Stella Montis, the entire facility's population was experiencing measurable neurological modification as a result of the ambient resonance environment that the amplifiers were creating. Some of those people had chosen to participate in the headband program, some had not. But all of them were, in the neurological sense, being affected. The facility had become, in a very real sense, an experiment being run on its own population, an experiment that the population had not fully consented to, and that was producing changes they could not undo simply by choosing to stop participating. The orbital auditory amplifiers are the component of Project Echostride 40 that most clearly illustrates the distance the project had travelled from its original purpose. They began as support infrastructure for a safety enhancement program. They became the mechanism by which the project's deepest effects were extended to a population that had not individually chosen those effects. They are, in the law's account, the expression of a logic that had been building throughout the project's development. The logic that applied benefit, real and genuine and demonstrable benefit, was sufficient justification for the means by which it was achieved. The amplifiers are where that logic produces its most consequential outcome, and they are, in the Arc Raiders universe, a lasting part of what Project Echostride 40 left behind. Chapter 7: The Ethics of Enhancement. There is a specific kind of discomfort that good science fiction produces when it takes a real ethical problem and embeds it in a fictional context that is detailed enough to make the problem feel concrete. Project Echostride 40 does this consistently, and Chapter 7 is where this video confronts that discomfort most directly. The ethical questions raised by what the project did are not abstract. They are grounded in specific choices made by specific people, choices whose consequences we have been building toward through the preceding chapters. The goal here is not to deliver a verdict, but to lay out the territory clearly enough that you can form your own view. The first and most fundamental ethical issue with Project Echostride 40 is the one that has been circling through the whole discussion: informed consent. The people at Stella Montis who participated in the headband program consented to participate in a safety enhancement program. They were told, with varying degrees of completeness, that the program was designed to improve their directional hearing in low-gravity conditions. What they were not told, at least not in any comprehensive or timely way, was that the technology they were using was producing persistent neurological changes that would outlast the specific conditions it was designed to address. This gap between what people consented to and what was happening to them is the core ethical failure of the project, if it is a failure. The qualification, if it is a failure, is important, because reasonable people, and the law suggests that reasonable people within the project disagreed about this, can argue about whether the gap matters if the undisclosed effects were beneficial. This is not a frivolous argument. The persistent neurological changes improve people's auditory processing in ways that extended beyond the low-gravity context. The people who experienced those changes felt better, performed better, and reported positive experiences of their sensory environment. The argument that disclosing the full nature of those changes would have been technically responsible, but practically harmful, that it would have caused anxiety and resistance without any corresponding benefit, is a position that has real-world analogues in the history of medical practice, but that argument rests on a paternalistic foundation that most ethical frameworks reject when it is stated clearly. The decision about what benefits are worth what means is not, in any ethical framework that takes individual autonomy seriously, a decision that the researchers get to make on behalf of the subjects. The purpose of informed consent is precisely to give individuals the information they need to make that decision for themselves. Taking that decision away from people, even when you're confident that they would make the same decision you're making for them, removes their agency in a domain where their agency is fundamental. The ambient population, the people at Stella Montis who were affected by the orbital auditory amplifiers without having individually consented to any research participation, represent an even clearer ethical problem. There is no framing under which the modification of a person's neurological function without their knowledge or consent is straightforwardly acceptable, regardless of the magnitude or direction of the effects being produced. The argument from benefit that the project's internal discussions used to justify the amplifier's operation does not hold up to the basic scrutiny that any first-year ethics student would apply to it. You cannot consent to benefit a person by doing something to them that they have not agreed to. The project's response to these ethical concerns, across its various phases and decision points, is characterized in the law by a pattern that is recognizable in the history of research ethics more broadly. Concerns were raised, documented, and in some cases actively discussed, but the institutional momentum of the project, the commitment of its leadership to the work, the genuine belief in its benefits, the investment of time and resources and relationships, all created a context in which the concerns were heard without being acted upon in the ways they deserved. The project kept moving. The ethical concerns became part of the record without becoming decisive factors in what actually happened. This pattern is not unique to Project Echostride or to the Arc Raiders universe. It is a pattern that appears in the real history of research that pushed into territory its existing ethical frameworks were not prepared for. The history of that research includes cases where the ultimate judgment was that the researchers were well-intentioned and made difficult decisions in good faith under conditions of genuine uncertainty. It also includes cases where the ultimate judgment was considerably harsher. Where a particular situation falls on that spectrum depends on the specific facts of what was known, when it was known, and what was done with that knowledge. The law about Project Echostride 40 provides enough of those specific facts to form a view, without being so specific that only one view is possible. One factor that complicates the ethical analysis is the question of alternatives. The people at Stellarmontis were living and working in conditions that were genuinely hazardous in ways that conventional approaches had been unable to fully address. The sensory impairments produced by low-gravity exposure were real, demonstrable, and associated with real accidents and real harm. Project Echostride 40 offered a way to reduce that harm. The alternatives to the project's approach, the environmental redesign that was only applicable to future facilities, the training programs that produced incremental improvements, the conventional protective equipment that addressed some problems, but not the directional processing issue, were less effective. If you care about the workers, you care about the harms they were experiencing, and the project was reducing those harms. This is a context that cannot be ignored in evaluating the ethical choices made by the project. Ethical decisions are made in specific circumstances, not in the abstract. The researchers and administrators who made the choices they made were not choosing between a perfect ethical approach and an imperfect one. They were choosing between imperfect options in circumstances where the cost of inaction was people getting hurt. That context does not erase the ethical problems with what was done, but it is essential to understanding why those decisions were made by people who, by the evidence of the law, genuinely cared about the people they were affecting. The irreversibility of the changes produced by Project Echostride 40 is a dimension of the ethical problem that deserves specific attention. The persistent neurological modifications documented in the project's data were not, as far as the available evidence suggests, harmful in themselves. They were improvements in a specific domain of cognitive function, but they were permanent in a way that the research had not initially anticipated. And permanence creates a form of ethical weight that temporary effects do not have. When you modify something temporarily, the person who was modified retains the option of returning to their previous state. They can evaluate the modification on the basis of experience and decide whether they want it to continue. That option, the option of reversibility, is a meaningful form of ongoing consent. When the modification is permanent, that option is gone. The decision made at the time of initial exposure cannot be revisited in the light of experience. Whatever was chosen, or was chosen for you, is what you have, permanently. Project Echostride 40's. Most consequential effects were permanent, and many of them were produced in people who had not explicitly chosen them. The combination of permanence and lack of explicit choice is the starkest expression of the project's ethical problem. The broader context of enhancement ethics in the Ark Raiders universe is relevant here. This is a fictional universe where the relationship between technology and the human body is significantly more active than in the contemporary world. Enhancement technologies of various kinds are part of the landscape of the universe, part of how people live and work, and relate to the environments they inhabit. The ethical frameworks of this universe are presumably shaped by this context in ways that differ from contemporary frameworks. What counts as informed consent, what counts as unacceptable modification, what the relationship between individual choice and collective benefit is understood to be, these are questions that the universe's ethical culture answers in ways we can only partially infer from the available law. This matters because it means that evaluating Project Echostride 40 through a purely contemporary lens might miss the specific ethical terms in which it was experienced and debated by the people in the story. The law's account of the internal ethical discussions within the project is not written as a story of people doing something they knew was clearly wrong by the standards of their world. It is written as a story of people making difficult judgment calls in circumstances where the right answer was genuinely unclear, where different people reasoning in good faith reached different conclusions. That framing asks us to take the complexity seriously, rather than reaching for easy judgment. At the same time, the law is not neutral about the ethical dimension of the project. The choices that were made and their consequences are presented in ways that invite critical evaluation. The pattern of raising concerns and not acting on them, the design choices that made the technology less visible, the gap between what the project told people it was doing and what it was actually doing, these are presented with a clarity that makes it hard to avoid the conclusion that something significant was wrong, even if the full extent and nature of that wrong is something the law leaves for the reader to work out. The people who are most directly affected, the workers at Stella Montis, are the people whose perspective on the ethical questions matters most. The law gives us glimpses of how they experienced the project and its technologies, through the subjective accounts of headband users, through the facility's operational records, through the implications of the monitoring data. What those glimpses suggest is a population that was, for the most part, genuinely grateful for the improvements the project had produced, that experienced the resonance technology positively and valued it, and that was largely unaware of the full extent of what was happening in their neurology. That last point is the one that the ethical analysis keeps returning to. A population that would have had to make different choices if it had been given different information is a population that was denied the ability to make those choices. The satisfaction they expressed with the project's outcomes was real, but it was satisfaction based on incomplete information. And satisfaction based on incomplete information is not the same as consent. It is not the same as a full and free endorsement of everything that was done to achieve the outcomes they were satisfied with. The law knows this, and it builds that knowledge into the texture of how the story is told. The question of responsibility is inevitably part of any ethical analysis of Project Echostride 40. Who, in the law's account, bears the most responsibility for the ethical failures of the project? The researchers who raised concerns and were transferred, the researchers who continued the work, the administrative leadership that made the decisions about disclosure, the facility administrators who agreed to host and facilitate the project, the structural features of the research culture that created the conditions in which these decisions were made. The answer is some distribution of all of these, weighted differently depending on the criteria you use to assign responsibility. What the law resists is a clean allocation. It does not give you one villain or one hero. It gives you a situation in which many people, making many decisions, in conditions of genuine complexity and genuine uncertainty, produced an outcome that the project's ethical frameworks were not adequate to handle. That outcome affected real people, in real ways, without those people having fully chosen what was being done to them. That is the ethical reality of Project Echostride 40. And the reason the Ark Raiders universe builds it into its lore is because this kind of outcome, this kind of gap between intention and consequence, between institutional culture and ethical practice, is a real feature of how large organizations operating at the frontier of capability tend to behave. The fictional frame makes it possible to see clearly what is sometimes harder to see in real contexts. The ethical legacy of Project Echostride 40 within the Ark Raiders universe is one of the factors that shapes how subsequent events in the lore are understood. The project is not an isolated incident. It is a precedent. It is evidence about what Miley Annalise was willing to do and how the institutional culture that produced the project would approach future ethical challenges. It is part of the information that other actors in the universe, whether they know it explicitly or not, are implicitly navigating when they engage with the technologies and the institutions that the project created. Understanding the ethics of Project Echostride 40 is, in this sense, essential to understanding the Ark Raiders universe at a level beyond individual events and artifacts. Chapter 8. What Echostride 40 left behind. The question of what remains from Project Echostride 40, what persists in the Ark Raiders universe as a result of what was done at Stellamontis, is one that touches almost every dimension of the project's story. The technologies it produced, the neurological changes it created in a population, the institutional knowledge it generated about what was possible, the unresolved questions about what was done and what it meant. All of these are parts of the project's legacy, and they do not resolve into a single, clean narrative. They remain in the universe as complications, as things that other parts of the story have to navigate and contend with. The technologies themselves, the resonance headbands, and the orbital auditory amplifiers, and the supporting infrastructure, are the most physically concrete part of the legacy. They exist in the game world in ways that are findable and interactable, which means they exist as part of the experience of players navigating the Ark Raiders universe. What the lore communicates about them, the accumulated context of what they are and what they do and how they came to be, is part of what those encounters mean. A resonance headband found in the game is not just a piece of equipment, it is an artifact of a specific history, and that history is part of its identity. The distribution of that technology beyond the specific context of Project Echostride 40 and Stellamontis is implied by the fact of its existence in the broader game world. Millet Analys's work did not stay contained within the original research program. The technology spread through channels that the lore does not exhaustively document, but whose existence is evident from the technology's presence in the world. Some of that spread was presumably official and deliberate, the normal commercialization and distribution of a research program's outputs. Some of it may have been less official. The history of sensitive technology escaping the context it was developed for is as old as sensitive technology itself. The neurological changes produced in the Stellamontis population are a part of the legacy that is harder to track and harder to understand from outside. The people who are affected by the project, whether through deliberate headband use or ambient amplifier exposure, carry those changes with them. They have been modified in specific ways by their experience at the facility. That modification is part of who they are now, part of how they experience and navigate the world. Whether those modifications are understood, by the people who have them, as enhancements or as something else, whether they create any complications in contexts outside Stellamontis, whether the long-term stability of the changes is what the project's data suggested it would be. These are questions the lore raises without fully resolving. The institutional knowledge that Project Echostride 40 generated about the mechanisms and the possibilities of resonance-based neurological modification is perhaps the most consequential part of its legacy. What Millet Analys learned over the course of the project's development represents a genuine advance in understanding that could, in principle, be built upon by any actor with access to that knowledge. The potential applications of that understanding go far beyond auditory processing enhancement in low-gravity workers. The project had demonstrated that you could produce targeted, directional, persistent neurological modifications in a human population through acoustic resonance technology. That demonstration has implications that extend into territories well beyond the safety research mandate where it began. The question of who has access to that knowledge and what they do with it is one that the Ark Raiders universe leaves partially open in a way that feels deliberate. Millet Analys holds some of it. The researchers who worked on the project hold some of it. The records at Stellamontis hold some of it. And somewhere in the gaps and transitions and turbulences that the Ark Raiders universe is built around, that knowledge exists in forms that are available to actors whose intentions and methods may be very different from those of the original project. This is the logic by which a research program becomes part of a larger and more dangerous story. Not necessarily through malice, but through the straightforward fact that knowledge, once created, does not stay in the box it was created in. The Ark Raiders themselves, the forces that give the game its name and its central conflict, exist in a universe that has been shaped by the kinds of decisions and developments that Project Echostride represents. The project is one data point in a much larger pattern of human technological ambition outrunning human ethical and political capacity to manage it. That pattern is, in the broadest strokes, what the Ark Raiders universe is about. The specific story of Project Echostride 40 illuminates that pattern from a particular angle, through the lens of a research program that was genuinely trying to make things better, and that produced, in the course of its genuine successes, a set of consequences that nobody had fully reckoned with. The Stellamontis facility itself is part of the legacy, not just as a location, but as a thing that has been changed by the project's operation. A facility where a significant fraction of the population has been neurologically modified, where the ambient acoustic environment has been shaped for years by the orbital auditory amplifiers, where the infrastructure of the resonance technology is embedded in the physical fabric of the place, is a different kind of place than it would have been without all of that. Whether those changes are visible to an observer arriving at Stellamontis without knowing the history, whether they manifest in ways that are obvious or subtle, is one of the questions that the lore leaves for exploration. The unresolved questions about what was done and what it means are perhaps the most enduring part of the project's legacy. Not the technological legacy or the neurological legacy, important as both of those are, but the open ethical questions that the project raised and did not close. These questions remain in the Ark Raiders universe as things that the world has to contend with. They are part of the moral texture of the universe, part of what makes it feel like a place that has history, that has made choices and lived with their consequences, that is navigating an ongoing relationship with the implications of its own capabilities. The way the Ark Raiders universe handles the legacy of Project Echostride 40 is consistent with its broader approach to the relationship between human ambition and human limitation. It does not resolve into a simple cautionary tale or a simple celebration of progress. It holds both possibilities, the genuine good that the project did and the genuine harm it caused, in tension with each other. It asks you to sit with the complexity rather than resolving it into a clean verdict. That is, in my reading of the lore, the most honest thing the universe can do with a story like this one. Because the real world is full of stories like this one, stories where good intentions and genuine achievement coexist with ethical failure and unintended consequence, and the clean verdicts we sometimes reach about them are usually incomplete. Project Echostride 40 is, in the end, a story about a gap, the gap between what the project set out to do and what it actually created. The gap between what the people at Stellamontis were told and what was actually happening to them. The gap between the institutional frameworks that governed the project and the ethical complexity of the territory it was operating in. The gap between the measurable benefits the project produced and the full reality of how those benefits were achieved. These gaps are not unique to this project. They are features of how ambitious, well-intentioned institutions tend to operate when they are moving fast toward goals they genuinely believe in conditions that reward results over reflection. Understanding those gaps, holding them clearly in mind, while also understanding the genuine good that the project produced, is what the Ark Raiders lore invites you to do. It does not make it easy. It gives you enough information to form a view without giving you so much that only one view is possible. It respects your ability to think through the complexity and reach your own conclusions. That respect is one of the things that distinguishes good lore from simple storytelling, and Project Echostride 40 is one of the places in the Ark Raiders universe where that respect is most clearly in evidence. The specific details of how the project ended, or at least how the available records about it become sparse and ambiguous, are something that the law handles with characteristic restraint. There is no single dramatic conclusion to point to, no moment of reckoning that the narrative builds toward and delivers. The project simply becomes harder to see in the record, its traces more fragmented, its continuation or conclusion more uncertain. What remains is the evidence of what it did, the technologies in the world, the modifications in the people, the knowledge in the institutional memory of mille annales, and the questions that no subsequent development has fully answered. Those questions are, what did Project Echostride 40 really produce, beyond the measurable improvements in auditory performance that were its stated purpose? What did mille annales know about the full extent of those additional productions, and when did they know it? What happened to the population at Stella Montis in the longer term as the neurological changes accumulated and the resonance ecology of the facility continued to shape the people living in it? And what does the knowledge that the project generated mean for the future of human enhancement in a universe where the pressures that produce that research are not going away? These are questions that the Ark Raiders universe keeps alive, keeps in play, keeps available for the ongoing process of building and understanding and engaging with a fictional world that takes seriously the complexity of what it means for humans to push beyond their natural limits into environments and capabilities that were not designed for them. Project Echostride 40 is one of the clearest expressions of that complexity. It deserves the attention it rarely gets. And now, having gone through all of this, you have the tools to give it that attention in the way it warrants. The resonance ecology of Stella Montis, the living system that Project Echostride 40 built and inhabited, did not simply cease to exist when the project's official records become sparse. Systems once created tend to persist. They tend to continue producing effects. The people modified by the project continue to navigate the world, carrying those modifications. The technologies continue to function in whatever spaces they inhabit. The knowledge continues to exist in the minds and institutions that hold it. The project's end, whatever form that end took, was not the end of its consequences. It was, at most, a transition from one form of consequence to another. And in the Ark Raiders universe, where history accumulates and shapes the present in ways that are often only partially visible, that transition is part of the ongoing story that the game invites you to participate in. Chapter 9, The Human Cost. All of the frameworks, the scientific ones, the institutional ones, the ethical ones, are ultimately frameworks for understanding what happened to people. Real people, or the fictional equivalents of real people, that the Ark Raiders universe populates with enough specificity to feel like more than background. The human cost of Project Echostride 40 is not measured in dramatic single events. It is measured in the accumulated weight of smaller things. The things people did not know about themselves, the choices they were not given, the ways their sense of their own normal functioning was permanently altered by a process they only partially understood. This chapter is about that texture, about what it would have meant to be a person at Stella Montis during the years Project Echostride 40 was operating. Start with the most basic fact of daily life in the facility during the project's peak operation. Every person who woke up, went to work, ate in the communal areas, moved through the corridors of Stella Montis was operating inside the resonance ecology that the project had built. The amplifiers were running. The headband users in the facility were generating their own closed-loop resonance fields that interacted with the ambient system. The acoustic environment of every space in the facility had been shaped by the project's technologies in ways that were subtle enough not to be immediately obvious but real enough to be measurable. This was the air people breathed, acoustically speaking. It was the medium they lived in. People adapt to their environments. This is one of the most fundamental things about human beings, and the people at Stella Montis adapted to theirs, the environment the project had created for them, without fully realizing they were adapting to something that had been constructed with specific effects in mind. The improvements in auditory performance that the project produced were experienced as improvements, as things getting better. The neurological changes that were accumulating were experienced as the new normal. This is how ambient change works. It does not announce itself as change. It simply becomes the way things are. The headband users had a more active relationship with the project than the ambient population did, but it was not necessarily a more informed one. The calibration process they went through when they first began using the headbands gave them a sense of participating in something technical, something that was carefully monitored and managed. The integration suites were professionally designed spaces that communicated competence and care. The researchers who worked with them were knowledgeable and, by all accounts, genuinely interested in their well-being. The experience of beginning to use the headbands was, for most people, a positive one. And positive experiences do not tend to prompt the kind of critical scrutiny that might reveal their complications. The trajectory of a typical headband user's experience, as the law suggests it, followed a consistent arc. Initial calibration and a period of adjustment, during which the technology was making itself felt in ways that were noticeable but not fully integrated. Then a period of increasing fluency, as the brain began incorporating the resonance patterns into its processing framework, during which the improvements in auditory spatial experience became more pronounced and more natural. Then a settled state in which the enhanced processing felt entirely native, in which the headband was no longer experienced as a device but simply as the way things sounded. This arc from novelty to seamlessness is one that users reported with enough consistency to be characteristic of the technology rather than idiosyncratic to individuals. The flip side of that arc, the experience of removing the headband after extended use, is where the human cost becomes most visible in the subjective accounts. People who had used the headbands for months described removing them as entering a kind of sensory fog. Not darkness, not the absence of sound, but a reduction in clarity and precision that they could feel as an absence. The spatial richness of their auditory experience diminished. Sounds that had been crisp and well located became more ambiguous. The cognitive effort of navigating the acoustic environment, effort they had not been consciously aware of expending before using the headbands, returned. They had learned what their perception could be, and the ordinary version of it now felt impoverished by comparison. This experience of subjective impoverishment on removal was not, by the measures the project was using, a sign of harm. The baseline state to which people returned when they removed the headbands was the same state they had been in before they started the program. Nothing had been taken away, but something had been given and then apparently withheld, and the experience of that gap was real and was distressing to many of the people who had it. The project's internal documents discuss this experience carefully. They note it, they monitor it, and they use it, in a way that is worth noting, as evidence for the technology's effectiveness. If people can feel the difference that clearly, then the enhancement is real and substantial. The distress of its absence is, in this framing, a measure of its value. That framing tells you something about the institutional culture that produced it. The distress of the people experiencing it was being processed not primarily as an ethical signal, but as a scientific one. The experience of missing the technology's effects was read as confirming the technology's efficacy. The question of whether people should have been placed in a position where they would miss it, whether producing that dependence without explicit informed discussion of its possibility was appropriate, was secondary in the project's internal discourse to the scientific information that the experience provided. There were workers at Stella Montis who experienced the project in ways that the official data did not fully capture. People who had ambivalent or negative responses to the headband technology, responses that did not fit the clean narrative of improvement that the project was generating, and that may, for that reason, have received less systematic attention in the reporting. The law points toward the existence of these experiences through gaps in the data and through the indirect evidence of personnel records from the facility during the project's peak period. There were people who stopped using the headbands and did not return to the program. There were people who requested transfers out of the facility during the project's operation, with stated reasons that, in some cases, point toward the acoustic environment as a source of discomfort rather than enhancement. These contrary experiences are not the majority of the picture that the law paints. The majority picture is of a technology that most people who used it found genuinely beneficial and genuinely valued. But minority experiences in research contexts are not just statistical outliers. They are information about the edges of what a technology does, about the range of ways that human variability interacts with a system that was designed for an averaged response. The project's handling of those minority experiences, its willingness or unwillingness to follow them into territory that complicated the majority narrative, is one of the measures of its research integrity. The workers who are part of the ambient population, those who never used the headbands but who lived and worked in the resonance ecology of Stella Montis for extended periods, occupy a particularly interesting position in the human story of the project. They did not experience the clear before and after of headband use. They did not have the reference point of entering and leaving a deliberately enhanced state. For them, the effects of the project's technologies were simply the way their acoustic environment worked, without any clear sense of what was natural and what was constructed. Their experience of the project is, in a sense, the purest test of what ambient environmental modification produces when people have no framework for recognizing it as modification. The subjective accounts available in the law from this population are appropriately less clearly marked as technology-related. People describe their work environment in ways that reflect the improvements the project had produced, noting that things had gotten easier, that communication felt clearer, that they had fewer of the spatial uncertainty symptoms that had previously been part of the experience of working in low-gravity conditions. They attribute these improvements to general factors: better facility management, accumulated experience, the natural adaptation of their bodies to the environment over time. The role of the amplifiers in producing what they were experiencing was not part of their account because it was not information they had been given. What the law does with these accounts is present them alongside the monitoring data that tells you what was actually happening, allowing you to read the subjective experience and the objective record together, to see the gap between what people understood about their experience and what the data shows was producing it. This juxtaposition is one of the more effective narrative techniques the law uses for conveying the ethical weight of what was done at Stella Montis without stating that weight explicitly. It trusts you to feel it in the gap between the two layers of the account. The medical staff at Stella Montis occupy a complicated position in the human story of the project. They were, presumably, the professionals most directly responsible for the health and welfare of the facility's population. They were in a position to observe the changes the project was producing in the people they were responsible for. And they were, in many cases, themselves affected by those same changes as members of the facility community operating within the resonance ecology. Their position was, in this sense, a microcosm of the larger institutional conflict of interest that ran through the whole project. Responsibility for the welfare of a population and active participation in a program affecting that population's neurology. The records that exist from the Stella Montis medical staff during the project period are, the law suggests, a source of some of the clearest documented awareness of the broader effects of the resonance technology. Medical professionals, by training and by professional habit, attend to the full range of what they observe in the people they are caring for. They are not focused, as the research team was, on a specific set of metrics. They see the whole person, and what the whole person presented over the course of the project's operation included things that the project's research metrics were not designed to capture. What those things were, specifically, is one of the places where the law is most suggestive and least explicit. The medical records from Stella Montis are referenced as existing, as containing information relevant to the full understanding of the project's effects, but their specific content is not laid out in the fragments of law available. This restraint is consistent with good law design. It leaves space for exploration and inference, while providing enough contextual information to make the inference meaningful. What the medical records contain is, in this reading, probably something that complicates the straightforward benefit narrative, something that was observed and documented by people whose job was to see the full picture, at a time when the project's official account was focused on a more limited view. The children and younger workers at Stella Montis, people who were at more plastic stages of neurological development than the majority of the facility's adult population, represent a specific dimension of the human cost question that the law touches on with particular care. Developing brains are more susceptible to environmental influences than adult brains, more readily shaped by the patterns of experience they are exposed to. The resonance ecology of Stella Montis, operating continuously on everyone in the facility, would have interacted with developing neurology in ways that differed from its interaction with adult neurology. The project's monitoring focused on adult subjects, on the working population whose performance it was designed to improve. The question of what the same ambient environment was doing to younger neurologies was not, as far as the available records suggest, a primary research focus. This gap in the research scope is itself a form of information about the project's priorities and its blind spots. A comprehensive safety evaluation of a technology affecting the ambient environment of a residential facility would naturally include attention to the effects on the most vulnerable members of that facility's population. The absence of that attention, or the subordination of it to the project's primary research focus, is consistent with the broader pattern of a project that was very good at seeing what it was looking for and less good at seeing what it was not.